Thank you for braving the cold tonight. We hope to bring some heat and light tonight to a very contentious issue here in the United States. My name is David Iglesias. I'm the new Hastert Center Director. And by way of background, I'm a former United States Attorney on the southwest border where I was responsible for enforcing federal law, including immigration law. The mission of the Hastert Center is to explore economics and politics and that intersection. So we'll be hosting approximately 2 symposia per semester. This is the first one that I'm hosting as director. And I need to tell you that I am the son of an immigrant from Panama who came to Ellis Island in 1936. My father became a naturalized American citizen in 1967. I'm also one of 2 people in this auditorium who was responsible for thousands of federal immigration prosecutions on the southwest border. To avoid cognitive dissonance on the issue of immigration, I have to remind myself there's a distinction between legal and illegal immigration. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what do the following individuals have in common? Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright, scientist and physicist Albert Einstein, the late comedian Bob Hope, the actor Cary Grant, musicians Gloria and Emilio Estefan, basketball superstar Akeem Olajuwon, and the architect I.M. Pye. The answer is they're all immigrants who enriched the United States through their contributions. That American melting pot sadly overheats sometimes and spills over, leading to anti-immigrant riots, protests, and sometimes even deadly violence, like the 100 Catholics who were killed in St. Louis in 1855 and the horrific lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in New Orleans in 1891. And I am thankful for Alex for blogging that information. We Americans are two-minded when it comes to immigration. Tonight we have experts with diverse perspectives who will talk to some of the many facets of immigration. In alphabetical order, we have former United States Attorney for the District of Arizona, Paul Charlton. He's a graduate of the University of Arizona for his undergrad and law school, where he served as the editor of the Arizona Law Review. He served as an assistant United States attorney or federal prosecutor for 10 years and 6 years as United States attorney. His district was normally the busiest federal district in the country and almost always led the country in immigration prosecutions. He's currently a partner in the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson, where he concentrates on complex litigation, internal investigation, and white-collar criminal defense. He's fluent in Spanish and has traveled on official orders to Mexico and Colombia. We have Mr. Ruben Navarrete, who's the most widely read Latino columnist in the country. He's a nationally syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group, whose twice-a-week column appears in nearly 150 newspapers, a CNN contributor who writes a weekly column for CNN.com, and a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors. He's contributed to the Wall Street Journal, the Denver Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Texas Monthly, Hispanic Magazine, Latino Magazine, and other publications. He's a graduate of Harvard College and the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's a published author of A Darker Shade of Crimson, Odyssey of a Harvard Chicano. He spent 12 years working for major U.S. newspapers and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in the commentary category by the Washington Post Writers Group in 2012. Also have Mr. Alex Naurasta, he's an immigration policy analyst at Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Previously, he was the immigration policy analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Houston Chronicle, the Boston Globe, the San Jose Mercury, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and many other journals. Alex has appeared on Fox News and numerous television and radio stations across the United States. He received his BA in economics from George Mason University and his master's in economic history from the London School of Economics. And our fourth panel member is Mr. Matthew Sorens, who serves as a U.S. Church Training Specialist for World Relief. Matthew assists churches in understanding the complexity of immigration from a biblical perspective. He previously worked as the Board of Immigration Appeals accredited legal counselor at the World Relief's local office here in DuPage County. And before that, he worked with World Relief in Nicaragua. Matthew is a co-author with Jenny Yang of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. He also serves as a field director for the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a coalition of Christian organizations of which World Relief is a founding member. Matt earned his bachelor's degree here at Wheaton College and his master's from DePaul University's School of Public Service. Without any further ado, I have a question for Mr. Navarrete. Ruben, in the many years you've covered stories, I understand you've written 2,000 columns, hundreds on the topic of immigration. Can you tell us how the narrative has changed over those years? If it's changed, and if it's changed, why has it changed?
David, thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for joining us. I think the main way in which it's changed is that the story has become much more complicated and nuanced than at least I initially perceived it. Maybe it was more nuanced then. I have a feeling that one thing that changed from the very first time I wrote a piece about immigration, to give you a sense of perspective here, my first immigration piece, so to speak, was right after the Los Angeles riots in 1991. In 1991, you could go to Washington, D.C. and go to events like this, and you did not have groups in Washington that were swimming in money, rivers of money coming in from the right and the left, groups that exist just to raise more money, that really don't have an interest in solving the problem because they want to perpetuate the problem so they can keep the money rolling in. That wasn't a reality in 1991. And in 1991, there was more of a sense at the beginning that it was just 5 years after IRCA had passed, after the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It's significant because it's the last time Congress did anything, to my mind, meaningful on immigration reform in a broad way and legalized over 3 million people. So we were still just living after the aftermath of IRCA, and I think Americans were just starting to understand demographic change in cities like Phoenix, Arizona, where I lived for a time, or in Dallas, Texas, where I lived for a time. They were still, the Hispanic populations in those cities were still relatively small compared to what they would become. And during the 90s, as the boom began and more cities began to grow and they needed people to build the homes, there was a real desire to hire more immigrants, and more immigrants came to those cities. So I would say, David, the main distinction I draw from where we are now is I think this issue is very, very complicated now. I think that there are holes in everybody's arguments, including my own, that I wasn't privy to before. And I think that if you really pay attention to the issue, you come away with an appreciation for just how intricate it is and how there are no simple solutions.
Thank you, but it seems to me that the narrative is stuck. We're in quicksand politically. You've seen the tremendously difficult other issues that major legislation or court rulings have been handed down. I think of legalization of marijuana, gay marriage, for example. That hasn't happened in the immigration debate, even though that affects, I suspect, a lot more people in America than those other issues. Why are we stuck?
I think the main reason I think we're stuck is because neither political party has an appetite to do what needs to be done on immigration, whether you're on the right or the left. If you're on the right, you think what needs to be done on immigration is either speed up deportations, crack down on the border, enforce the laws we already have, and take a stand against amnesty, as they call it. And if you're on the left, what you want to do boils down to really legalizing the 11 million who are here without documents. But neither political party wants to engage that discussion, because what results very quickly is a civil war within the parties. If you're a Republican, you have to referee a fight between business interests that want reform and nativist interests that don't. And if you're a Democrat, you have to referee a fight between organized labor, which doesn't want reform, no matter what you read in the paper. It doesn't want reform, and the Latino community that does want reform. And no politician wants to referee a fight within their ranks, within their base. It's messy, it's complicated. They would much rather fight the old battle of red versus blue on Crossfire than they would want to referee a fight when parents hate it when their kids squabble. And I think that's what you have with the parties. They don't want to necessarily get into the nuts and bolts of this discussion because it gets messy very quickly.
Thank you, and I'll come back to that. And I should have said at the beginning, you'll have an opportunity to write your questions on a 3x5 card. My assistants will be bringing those up at a later time for me to read those. My next question is for Paul Charlton. Paul, under what circumstances can the U.S. government prosecute immigrants for illegal entry? Because aren't typically entry without inspection a misdemeanor, and why is the United States government interested in enforcing misdemeanor crimes?
I hope this is on. I hope you can hear me, and let me answer that question. But first, let me say, whenever I'm in an academic setting like this and with scholars like these who are on this panel, I feel compelled, in the spirit of full disclosure, to tell you that when I graduated law school, I graduated magna cum laude. So I feel very fortunate to be here. It is a privilege to be here, and especially, if I may add, that it's a privilege to be here with my friend David Iglesias. I know he is relatively new to this job, but I will tell you, because I have seen him in the most difficult of situations, this is an extraordinary human being with a moral compass second to none, and I think you have found yourself an outstanding director here. So David, thank you for the invitation, and I'll get to your question now. What is the U.S. position? How is it that we prosecute individuals who enter the country? If you enter the country between the ports of entry, as the law says, which means illegally, you have committed a misdemeanor. Thank you. If you enter the country between the ports of entry, you've committed a misdemeanor. And so if I can, David, let me just tell a story about what I learned about illegal immigration as the U.S. Attorney. Before I became the U.S. Attorney, I was a line assistant, a prosecutor, career prosecutor, best job I'll have ever had. And in those days, 1991 to 2001, you got to do a whole variety of cases. But I don't think I really understood what the immigration problem was. You were assigned a case, you prosecuted the case, and you saw the result. When I became U.S. Attorney, it was an opportunity to become more involved in the problem south of the border. And so in 2001, 2002, I took a trip to a small town in northern Mexico, south of the Arizona border, south of the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation, a town very few of you will have heard, but if you enter the country illegally, it is a town you will know by heart. It is a town called Altar, A-L-T-A-R. And Altar is a kind of crossroads for those who wish to enter Arizona unlawfully. You stay in Altar, you stage there, and then you cross through the desert. And if you cross through the desert during the summer months, you are, in a very real sense, at risk of dying. We went to Altar, the American consul officer for Hermosillo, and Border Patrol liaison officers who were stationed in Mexico, to see what we could learn about Altar and the possibility of working with the Mexican government, and perhaps slowing, if not stopping, the tidal wave of people who were crossing the border at that point in time. And I should tell you that at that point in time, in Arizona alone, and this is now about 2005, 2006, they were detaining approximately 500,000 individuals who were coming across the border unlawfully. Those are the individuals they caught. Today, nationwide, only about 600,000 people are caught entering the country. So you can understand the disparity then and now. We were in Altar. We spoke with a group of women who were there in the plaza, getting ready to meet their coyotes who are going to take them across the border. And I began to speak with them about their upcoming journey and talk to them about why they were crossing into the United States. And I asked them, you understand, and certainly people have shared with you, the very real risk, this is July, of dying in the desert. And they began to cry, these women, and said, yes, we understand. One of the programs we were encouraging the Mexican government to participate in was the opportunity to provide free transportation from Altar back to the hometowns for these individuals after they had been warned of the threat of dying. And I asked these women, would you return? Would you go back to your hometown if today I could get you a bus ride and a free ticket to go home? And they said, no, I can't go home. My family has spent every penny to get me into the United States. I will risk my life to enter the United States unlawfully. So, David, to your question, what do we do on the law enforcement side? What did we do? Better said, I'm no longer in that position. What did we do? We tried to effect a deterrent policy. We tried to make it known that if you were caught, you would spend some minimal amount of time in jail. If you were a coyote, you would spend a more significant amount of time in prison. But if you are willing to risk your life to enter the United States, if you're willing to cross the desert in the summertime, 30 days in jail, 40 months in prison is not going to stop you. There is a deterrent effect. There is a deterrent value. Otherwise, we would have open borders and even greater numbers of people entering the country unlawfully. But what I know from having been to Altar, what I know from having prosecuted the cases as a line assistant and supervising those attorneys when I was the U.S. attorney, is that it is not the answer to the problem, and that there has to be a more holistic view of what it is we can do to address this issue.
Thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words. I think your honorarium was much too low in light of those kind words. I need to tell you that Mr. Charlton is the only United States attorney of any administration who was so provocative in a town hall meeting in Arizona that a citizen threw a burned-out log at him after his comments. So here, please don't throw anything at Mr. Charlton. Paul, what I've been advised by my old office and looking at some of the numbers online is the number of illegal entries has dropped significantly since you and I were United States attorneys. Given that as a fact, why is it that the prosecution numbers aren't dropping at the same level?
I'm not a statistician, so I can't explain this well. But what I can tell you generally is that the resources available to law enforcement in the form of prosecutors and Border Patrol agents has increased. And so while the number of individuals seeking to enter the country unlawfully may be decreasing, what has remained static or increased are the number of individuals dedicated to prosecuting those people. And so the numbers of prosecutions will stay static or increase because there are more bodies to throw at the problem, if you will.
Thank you very much. My next question will be for Matt Sorens. As evangelicals, we believe that Holy Scripture is sufficient in many, many areas, although in my reading of Scripture, there's no mention of the word immigration. So can you share with us your thoughts on how Scripture, and specifically what verses you would draw the audience to look at in terms of how should we treat immigrants, whether they're legal status or illegal status?
Yeah, so as a Christian, I would hope that the first lens through which we view any tough issue like this is through the worldview of our Christian faith. But I think that's actually not that common. The Pew Research Center found in 2010 that 12% of white evangelical Christians, which is my category of Christians, said that they think about immigration primarily from the perspective of their faith. So as a Wheaton grad who was taught, the integration of faith and learning, that's kind of a scandal, right? Like, very few Christians ever think about what the Bible says as they think about this issue. And some might think, well, that's because the Bible doesn't have anything to say to this. Or maybe there's Romans 13, we should be subject to the governing authorities. What part of illegal don't you understand? And certainly we need to get to Romans 13. But the Bible actually has a lot to say on the topic of immigration. It may not, depending on which English translation you use, the Common English Bible will actually use the word immigrant for the Hebrew word ger. Most of our translations, that's a foreigner or a sojourner or an alien. But that Hebrew word ger appears 92 times in the Old Testament. And it is basically the idea of a resident alien. And God has a lot to say to the Israelites in particular in the Old Testament on how to treat those who are foreigners in their land. I won't go through 92 verses, but the big themes are treat them justly. Immigrants or aliens, sojourners are mentioned over and over again alongside the widow and the orphan. Sometimes it's alongside the poor. Nick Wolterstorff, who's a Christian philosopher, calls that the quartet of the vulnerable. And we find those groups of people over and over and over again, especially in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew prophets and in the books of the law, as people who were uniquely vulnerable, whom God called his people to love, to treat well. You also have the theme in the Old Testament of God telling the Israelites, look, you need to remember that you yourselves were immigrants, that you were foreigners in the land of Egypt, and you were not treated well there. And so when God says, and he says it both in the book of Exodus to the people leaving, and then a generation later as people are entering the promised land, speaking of their ancestors, he says, look, you need to remember that it was my grace that brought you from that place of desperation, of slavery in Egypt, to where you are now. Because if you forget that, you'll turn to the people who come after you as immigrants into your land, and you'll be just as terrible to them as Pharaoh was to you. Which, most of us in this room, if you're not completely Native American, have that immigrant story as well. And I think we would do well to let our immigrant heritages, whether that was last week or 500 years ago, whether it was the Mayflower or a slave ship or Ellis Island, to inform how we think about this topic today. And most of us have forgotten. I know I've forgotten. I grew up, my family's Dutch. We grew up with this idea, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. You laugh, but that's kind of racist, right? But that my grandmother kind of believes it. But I know that we have these cute wooden shoes in our basement, and we have windmill cookies at Christmas time. But I don't know the stories of my ancestors and what they went through. But if you look at American history, whether it was, the Germans who Benjamin Franklin thought could never possibly assimilate into Pennsylvania, or the Chinese, you can look up the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's kind of disturbing what we passed into law in 1882. The Irish, the Italian, just about every immigrant group. There were some people who welcomed them, and hopefully some people in the church who welcomed them. And some people, including plenty of people in the church, especially when it was Protestants, responding to Catholics or Jewish people, who said, no more space here. And so we've got a very mixed history, and I think we would do well biblically to let that inform us. Lastly, in terms of Scripture, I would say there's the idea of hospitality, and that's both Old and New Testament. I grew up with a misunderstanding of the sense of hospitality. I thought it meant having my friends over for lunch, or maybe something about the Food Network or Martha Stewart. It was a sort of idea of really fancy meals. It's an industry, right? There's a hospitality industry. But actually, hospitality in the Greek of the New Testament is philoxenia. It is the love of strangers. That's actually a requirement for leadership in the church in 1 Timothy and Titus. Matthew 25, Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Of course, he goes on to say to the disciples, well, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did unto me. I don't want to promise biblically that strangers are always safe. And I think the government has a really important role to play here, and I'm not diminishing that. But I do think as Christians that we're commanded to love and welcome strangers. It doesn't only mean immigrants, but certainly includes that. Hebrews 13 says that by entertaining strangers, some people have entertained angels without realizing it. So there's this possibility that maybe these people who many in our society see as a threat, as people who might be a problem, could actually be a blessing. And I would note that that's the experience of pretty much every evangelical denomination in the United States, which is seeing its fastest growth, frankly, sometimes its only growth, because of immigration and the second and third generation of immigrants. So there's a lot there biblically, and then none of that's about illegal immigration, right? So I think the tension that a lot of Christians feel is, okay, maybe we should love and welcome people, but what about those who violated the law? And Romans 13 was a passage many people would go to. It says that we should be subject to the governing authorities, that the authorities that exist have been established by God. And I think that's the tension for a lot of believers who want to be faithful to Scripture. The good news for those of us who are citizens, and I get nervous around U.S. attorneys, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. There's not that many ways as a U.S. citizen to violate immigration law. I mean, if you employ someone, that's a big red flag area. But teaching someone English, or being kind to someone, or teaching them Sunday school, or letting them teach Sunday school to you, as long as there's no compensation involved, none of those things are unlawful. So I think to look at Romans 13 and say, what part of illegal don't you understand? We should shun those people, is not an appropriate exegesis of that passage. It's harder for our brothers and sisters, and you should know that there are many of them who are themselves here unlawfully. And there's a guy in my neighborhood where I used to live in Glen Ellen. He's a Baptist. We had this conversation a few years ago, and he came to this country illegally from Mexico probably 25 years ago. 2 kids and his wife. Now he's got 4 more kids. Came to know the Lord here. Went through a theological program here. He knows his Bible better than I know mine. And we had this conversation once. He said, I read Romans 13, and I desperately want to get right with the law. And one thing that's important to understand is, for most people here unlawfully, You can't get right with the law unless you go back. There's not a process. He talked to lawyers, he talked to our legal counselors over at World Relief, and we all told him the same thing, that you can go back to your country, no problem. But coming back legally, not possible. Not if you wait a year, not 5 years, not 10 years, doesn't matter how much money you want to pay. And so he desperately wants to follow the law. He also, he looks at a passage like 1 Timothy 5:8. It says that if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially his immediate family, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And he would say, gosh, I came here because I desperately wanted to provide for my family, but I want to follow the law, so what should I do? And, I don't pretend to know for sure the right answer to that question, but I do know it's a really complicated question, and I wish I could tell him, what you need to do is go pay this fine, fill out these forms, wait in this line. He's not looking for amnesty, a free pass. He'd be willing to pay anything. But he wants to be able to stay with his family. And frankly, his kids born here in high school, they're not going to go back to Mexico. It's not back to Mexico. They're going to go live with their cousins before they go to a country they've never been to. And it's a situation that our nation has in many ways created by having an immigration policy that didn't make a lot of sense economically, and I'm sure Alex can talk to that more than I can.
Oh, he's next.
And so, but instead of, it's impossible, I think, hopefully Paul will agree with me on that, to fully enforce that law as it's written now with the limits on, when you have people so desperate for a job, the challenge is if they get here, they find it. They find the job, they fit into our economy, they're able to file and pay their taxes, they fit in a lot of ways, including into our churches, and it's just a mess. And so that's where, my perspective is as Christian, Romans 13 tells us to respect the rule of law. We need to do that. Our current system does not honor the law because it's unenforceable. So I would say let's get an enforceable law. People should pay a fine if they violated a law. I think there should be consequences. But what is that process that we create? And I think more and more Christians are realizing there's a sweet spot there, somewhere between amnesty and let's deport everybody, that makes a lot of sense from the perspective of our faith.
Thank you very much, and I'll ask some follow-up questions later on Romans 13, because clearly teaching English, giving water to somebody, giving food would not get you in the crosshairs of the U.S. government. However, I would suggest to you that driving them across the border, knowing that they're illegal, would get you in trouble with the United States government. We can come back to that later. So one of the things that the Hastur Center does is economics, in addition to government and public policy. So I have a question for Alex. A lot of the controversy you hear is that immigrants take and take. They bankrupt counties on the border. They bankrupt hospitals. They're overwhelming our social services. And you hear that from one side. And then from the other side, you hear, wait a minute, they're providing below market wages. The American businesses are actually making money by paying in cash and not having to worry about taking out taxes. So my question to you, sir, is, as an economist, do immigrants take more than they give, or do they give more than they take to the American economy?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I think it's important to start answering this question with explaining what the legal immigration system currently looks like. A lot of people have in their minds this idea that Ellis Island is still open, that all you need to do, just go wait in line, have a little inspection, fill out a form, misspell your name on something, and pretty much you can come in, and it's just a wait period. But it hasn't been that way in about a century. The current system today is second in legal complexity to the income tax. Now, I know a lot of you out there are students and you haven't paid income taxes yet. Oh, but you will. And you'll know what I'm talking about. So you have a system right now. So there's 4 ways to come in here on a green card, right? The first way is be very highly skilled and 1 out of 140,000 a year, 40,000 people a year, and have an American company that wants to pay between $10,000 and $35,000 in legal fees and government fees, and only 7% of you can come from any one country, and a whole lot of other nonsense. That's one way. Another way is if you're closely related to an American currently. The other way is if you're a refugee or an asylee, there's some slots set aside for those folks. And then there's something called a diversity lottery, 50,000 people a year. Now, if you notice, one category that is missing from this is the low-skilled immigrant who's not related to an American. which is the category that virtually all of our ancestors entered in on. If we apply the current immigration laws that we have today backwards in time, almost none of us would be here today. I hate to tell you this, but in 1940, to give you an example, only 12% of adult Americans had a high school degree. Only 12%. The percentage of immigrants was in the single digits. So there's no way today that this would work out. So what about the economics of it? Do immigrants pay their way? Economists are famous for disagreeing about almost everything all the time. But there are three broad areas where almost every economist, from Paul Krugman on the left to Milton Friedman on the right, will agree on this. Three big issues. One is free trade is good. The second is price controls are bad. And the third is that immigration is good for the economy. The only question is, well, how good and exactly for whom and how much? Oh, well, those are pretty boring questions once you really answer the big one, which is that it is good for us. Economists have this sort of calculation they use called a place premium. What this is the estimated increase in wages that an immigrant would get by coming to the United States from each country they come from. So a Mexican immigrant from Mexico coming to the US has the same characteristics as a similar American, can expect a threefold increase in wages. Threefold, just by crossing a border. Guatemalan threefold, Vietnamese sixfold, Haitian tenfold. And that's after adjusting for the prices of the things that they have to buy here. Okay? So those are wage pressures greater than anybody in this room has probably ever faced in their life and will likely ever face. The difference is, if I get a job offer in Alaska, I can go there because I'm an American. If somebody in Mexico or Central America or Asia gets a job offer, they can't come. Almost guaranteed, because there's no way for them to come here. So this enormous pressure, this willingness to die in the desert, to come here and get this country is borne out in large part by these gains that they can use to help their family. So economists like to do a lot of these crazy calculations, right? They like to shock people. I don't think there's another academic profession that is less politically correct than economists, which is why I like it. So they start with this calculation, this sort of model. Economists love models. How does the world economy work? And they say, okay, well, what would happen tomorrow if there was open borders globally? What if anybody from any country can move to any other country and get a job? And the wages in these countries can move, and people can move from places like Zambia, where they're dirt poor and can't make anything, to New York City, and they can be productive. What would the economic effect of that be globally? Well, the models estimate that global GDP would increase between 50 and 150% per year going forward. That's somewhere between $35 and $105 trillion of additional stuff made every year. Now, I'm from Washington, D.C. $1 trillion doesn't mean a whole lot there. But when you're talking about $100 trillion, that's a lot of money. So for the finance people in the audience, that's somewhere around a present value of $800 trillion, just by making this change right now. There is no other single policy change that you can make in the world today, anywhere, that will have nearly the impact on human well-being as reforming immigration laws and making it easier for people to move. Now, that's all well and good. A lot of this economic gain goes to the immigrants themselves. We all realize immigrants are people, but what we're really concerned about, I say the but we're really concerned about is, how does immigration affect us? Immigrants are going to be coming here, they're going to be living in our communities, they're going to be, our coworkers or bosses. How does this affect us? Well, the evidence is pretty clear. The most negative finding that you will find in the entire academic peer-reviewed literature, and I read all these boring papers all the time, so you guys don't have to, is that all of the 30 million immigrants that came here between 1990 and 2006 lowered the wages of Americans with less than a high school degree by about 3%. That is the most negative finding that you will find. That's it. Most of the findings in the literature find that every single group of Americans by education saw wage increases during this time period. Now, if any of you know anything about economics, you think, well, that sounds kind of weird. We have a large increase in the number of workers, a big increase in supply. Why didn't wages fall? Seems kind of odd, right? Why didn't wages fall? Well, part of it is because immigrants are, and we miss this often, but immigrants are not like apples or steel or automobiles where we just increase the numbers and the prices go down. They're also people, they buy things. They don't just increase supply and make more workers and more jobs and things like that. They also buy things made by other Americans. So the two most recent ethnic and racial groups in the United States who came as immigrants, Hispanics and Asian Americans, spend every year over $2 trillion in the U.S. economy. Now, that's $2 trillion. It supports a lot of job opportunities that hire a lot of Americans, that increase demand for jobs. They're twice as likely to start a business as native-born Americans, which is tremendous because we're known for our entrepreneurship around the world. Because immigrants are different from us, initially, there's not much competition to begin with. So economically, the data is clear. Immigrants are a boon for us as well as for themselves. Now, what about these other issues? We do live in a society with a welfare state. We do live in a society that taxes a lot of people, a lot of money, and gives to other people. What are the net sort of impacts of this? Do immigrants receive more through this system that, as you can tell, I'm not a fan of, than they pay in taxes into it? Now, I wish I had a big, sexy answer for you. I've read about 80 academic studies on this. I have a book chapter coming out on it. I've done a lot of econometrics, which is a really terrible word, and about this stuff. And basically, the net effect of all immigration on all budgets in most places, most of the time, almost everywhere, is about zero. They pretty much pay their way almost all the time. Now, I wish I could say immigration would solve all the budget deficit problems. I wish we could, I wish I could say that. I can't say that. But they certainly don't make them any worse. Unauthorized or illegal immigrants in the U.S. do not have recourse to means-tested welfare benefits, with the exception of emergency medical care and some small things like that. If you're a legal immigrant on a green card, you don't have access to these programs for the first 5 years, once you're here in the United States. If you come here at the age of 18 and you start working, you're a low-wage worker, you're not going to pay too much in taxes, you're not going to take much in government services. But what's the other big expense that they skip if they come at the age of 18? What's that big thing that makes all of us enormous fiscal drains for the first 18 years of our lives? That's right, public education, $10,000 to $20,000 a year per student. Oh man, if you count everybody up to the age of 18, we're all fiscal wastes. You have to count the rest of our lives, of course. So what does this immigrant skip out on if he comes after the period of time with public education? That means we've got like a freebie. We've skipped out on paying $120,000 to $240,000 of public funds for an education for somebody, and then he can already start working and paying taxes. Enormous benefit. And then 30% of them retire in their home country, so they don't even get Social Security or Medicare. So it's really, in some of these ways, it can be a boon if done properly. Since we're in a liberal arts university, I think I have to bring back, some of the ancient Greek, Xenophon. I read a lot of this stuff because I can't get too obsessed with immigration, and unfortunately, reading Xenophon, he talks about immigration all the time. One of the ways that he came about for the ancient Athenian government of solving their budget crises was to have more immigration because they pay a lot in taxes and don't take much in benefits. And the arguments are the same over 2,000 years ago as they are today. I think the difference is that now there's a megaphone for people who don't know much about economics because it can be a dry and boring subject at times, and it's poorly taught, not here, of course, but a lot of other places it's poorly taught all the time. And it's our job as economists to try to teach the public, to try to give the public at least some of these insights so that they can go forward on it. But this is the one point I want to leave you with. People are the ultimate resource. People are the source of wealth and prosperity. If I could choose to live in two places in the world, where would I want to live? Like a place that is massive oil reserves under the ground, but the laws are terrible, people are unfree, there aren't too many of them? Or do I want to live on a barren rock somewhere with millions of other people? Well, the latter one, the barren rock, is Hong Kong, one of the richest places in the world that has no natural resources at all. And the other one is Saudi Arabia. All right, one has a lot of natural resources, the other one has a lot of people who are very productive. People are the source of these things, and fundamentally what I think underlies the anti-immigrant argument is an extreme form of misanthropy. So that's what I'm going to leave it as.
Well, thank you, Alex, for introducing us to a new paradigm, a economist with a sense of humor.
Definitely.
So, Paul, during our time, you and I represented 2/5 of the Southwest Border Defense against illegal immigration, and you and I were responsible for many thousands of prosecutions, you more than me. To give you an idea of scale, in my peak year in my district, 140 miles of border with Mexico, we interdicted 100,000 illegal immigrants. That sounds like a lot of people, but that's peanuts compared to the District of Arizona, where their peak year, I believe they interdicted 500,000. Obviously, it's impossible to prosecute that number of cases. The typical Justice Department year includes about 75,000 prosecutions nationally. So we had to figure out ways to pick the cases that needed to go forward. But my question to you, Paul, is doesn't America have the legal and moral responsibility to set immigration entry standards and enforce it?
Well, I guess the easy answer to that is yes, we do. The more difficult question, and the one that I'm grateful to listen to Matt talk about, is what's the right thing to do? I mean, it's clear to me that we need to have a deterrent effect of some kind, that we need to be able to tell people who are thinking about coming into the country unlawfully that there are repercussions, that you will have to pay a debt to our society if you are caught. Otherwise, we will have that open economy that Alex was talking about. There has to be, in my mind, some rule of law as relates to the border. But I will tell you this story, too, and it occurred to me as you were talking about it, Matt. My son, who is the product of a Jesuit education, went to a Jesuit high school, and while I was the U.S. attorney, the Jesuits took him to Nogales, Sonora, and the Jesuits there had a home in Nogales, Sonora, which is immediately south of Nogales, Arizona, right on the border, in which they were housing individuals who had been voluntarily deported back into Mexico. My son was down there, speaks Spanish too, was visiting with them, talking to them, hearing these extraordinary stories about people who were separated from their families, having spent much of their resources, if not all of their resources, to come into the United States only to be deported. And he came back and he asked me, Dad, are you really prosecuting these people? It's a tough question. But the answer is yes, we were. But it's a question to which I think students here at Wheaton, and I'm glad to hear that they are struggling with. That as someone, and I like to think of myself as a person of faith, should struggle with and wonder about. Where I fall down, I guess, as an old law enforcement guy is maybe I need to study the economics a little more, but I don't like the idea of a completely open border. To me, there is not just an aspect that relates to illegal immigration, but a national security issue as well. And if we have a completely open border without people inspecting individuals as they come into the United States, making sure that they enter through the ports of entry as opposed through the desert, then we are at risk of individuals coming to this country who would seek to do us harm. So I struggle with the faith aspect of prosecuting people who only want to better their lives. I struggle with the verse from Matthew. But I, at the end of the day, rightly or wrongly, agree that we need to have a law enforcement presence on the border, that there ought to be a deterrent. And I think comfortable with that conclusion.
Thank you. Ruben, you've written many, many articles over the past 20 years about immigration. You've grew up in the West and in the Southwest. You've been to many of these forums. You've been viciously attacked online. You're frankly a magnet for people from the extreme right, extreme left, who are trying to heap abuse on you. But tell us, what do you believe, based on your vast experience, what is it that most Americans do not understand about the immigration debate?
Okay, I thank you for that. First, I want to say the reason I'm routinely attacked is because those folks haven't met Alex yet. I can't wait to call my wife later and say that the guy with the brightest personality on the panel was The Economist. And she'll say, huh? Huh? Just
time to turn that around.
Here, I'm going to get to what I think Americans don't get, and it comes down simply to it's always easier to criticize external factors and never internal factors. The immigration debate, you've heard the phrase smoke and mirrors. The immigration debate is full of smoke, but it has no mirrors. People never look in the mirror. They wonder, why do we have illegal immigration? Well, it's Mexico's fault. It's the fault of the coyotes. It's the fault of big business. Nobody thinks about the fact that the #1 employer of illegal immigrants in America is the American household. Gardener, nanny, housekeeper, elderly caregiver. We have illegal immigrants taking care of our babies and of our grandparents. And so nobody ever cops to it. Nobody ever says, it's my fault. I'm the problem. It's always somebody else's problem. And I think that the tension that exists, and where I'm going to arrive is to say something really controversial, because that's what I do, but it's going to answer your question as to one thing that Americans don't understand about this debate. The basic tension in this debate, and as was pointed out before, this is a country where the national motto, historically, back to the way Franklin talked about the Germans, has never been, no matter what they teach you in civics class or government, it's never been in pluribus unum, of many one. Our national motto in this country is, there goes the neighborhood. Every single immigrant group has always been treated badly and viewed as inferior to the people who are already here. What they did to the Germans, to the Irish, to the Italians, to the Chinese, to the Jews, they now do the Mexicans. It's our way. It's part of being America. Our paradox is that we are a nation of immigrants that has never really liked immigrants. And it becomes a problem because while we don't like immigrants, what you find is that in every nation on the globe where you have an immigration problem, the same people who are complaining about immigrants cannot live without them. I was in Israel 2 years ago, fascinating country, wonderful place, loved the place, fell in love with the place. Before the Intifada, they used to have Palestinians cleaning their homes. They eventually decided that wasn't a secure thing, so they got rid of the Palestinians. The answer is, did they then learn to clean their homes themselves? No. They brought in people from Southeast Asia to clean their homes. So you're always going to have this sort of sense of this paradox between not liking a group, thinking them inferior, and at the same time needing them. And here's the controversial part, and here's what Americans don't understand or don't want to understand. The reason we get to that point is because we don't just have bad laws. I haven't made up my mind if we have bad laws. I agree with Paul, you have to enforce the law. I'm the grandson of a Mexican immigrant, but also the son of a cop. Those are the things running in my head, right? Immigrants are the best thing about this country. Without immigrants, the United States would be severely impoverished. My grandfather came legally because he came during the Mexican Revolution. You couldn't come illegally until after 1924. And like many Mexicans, he came in that time period, a 10-year revolution in Mexico, from 1910 to 1920. But my dad was a cop, and I was not raised to take lightly infractions of law. But the controversial thing that most Americans don't want to accept is that this is not a question of laws. It's a question not of bad laws, but of bad parenting. Our #1 failure in America is not what they say on talk radio about the fact that we have a fluid border or a porous border or a corrupt government or whatever. Our #1 failure is that we are raising our kids poorly. We are raising our kids, and I speak as someone who has a 5, 7, and 9-year-old, we are raising our kids to not do those jobs that Grandpa once did. So we think proudly about the fact that Grandpa used to do these jobs, but we would never have our own kids do these jobs. Our kids don't have summer jobs, they don't have after-school jobs, they don't work in the local drugstore or at Starbucks, let alone in the fields picking peaches, where I come from in Central California. So we have bad parenting. You say that out loud and people attack you because nobody wants to look in the mirror and say, you know what, you're right. I'm not just part of the problem because I won't do those jobs. I'm part of the problem because when I go to my club or to PTA, I say, Susie's home from Stanford and she's working at a law firm. I don't say, Susie's home from Stanford and she's working in a fruit packing house, in a cannery, along immigrant laborers. You don't say that. So we're raising our kids not to do those jobs, which has created a vacuum, a need for these other people to do these jobs. They happen to be people we look down on, and round we go.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think I have a story that fits in perfectly. I was here about 10 years ago talking to a Wheaton class, and we got on the topic of enforcement of immigration, and a young man raises his hand. I believe he was from Nebraska, and the previous summer he'd worked as a groundskeeper for a golf course. And he said that all his friends gave him a hard time because he was the only natural American, the only Anglo-American working, that everybody else was an immigrant. And my comment was, well, shame on your friends and shame on their parents, because what you're doing is honest work. So your comment resonates. Paul, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to, on a slightly different subject, but talking about parenting, whatever the number it is you believe to be accurate, the 11 million, the less than 11 million, the greater than 11 million individuals who are here unlawfully, are by and large hardworking, good people, men and women of faith who have a terrific work ethic. But if you live in Arizona, and in particular in Maricopa County, where our famous Sheriff Joe Arpaio resides, your children are afraid of law enforcement. When I grew up, certainly sounds like when Ruben grew up, we embraced law enforcement. It was great to see the cops in the neighborhood. We are raising a whole generation of individuals, especially in Arizona, who are from great parents, but who fear the presence of law enforcement, because law enforcement means arrest for their parents, deportation, separation. And I worry about that as a law enforcement or a former law enforcement guy. I don't like the idea that children are being raised in an environment where they don't like the cops for all the wrong reasons.
Thank you. Alex.
One of the most common jokes, going off of what Ruben said, one of the most common jokes around about this is, ever since my family immigrated here, they've had problems with immigrants. And that goes back as far as you can say. And but I'm going to try to up Ruben in terms of being controversial right now.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think the problem is necessarily with the raising of kids. I think he has a good point about that. I don't know if that's necessarily the problem. I think the problem is how we view democracy, actually. I love democracy. I think democracy is a great form of government. It makes us great. But it's very easy to say something and to express that through a vote. It's very easy to say, I don't like immigrants. I don't want them here. I don't want them to take my job, and to express that in the ballot box. But it is very difficult to do that in your life. So there's this cognitive dissonance that's out there everywhere. You'll have somebody who's a small business owner say, I don't like immigrants, and he'll vote for the guy who doesn't like immigrants. And then he'll be upset when his business gets raided. He'll be like, oh, why not, why me? I had to do it because every other business hires him, blah, blah, blah. Makes all these excuses in the world for himself. So the reason why we have such poorly enforced laws when it comes to immigration, I think economically that's better for us. But the reason why we have such poorly enforced laws is because we don't recognize the cost of enforcing them is enormous and will be borne by a lot of us. And I don't think we're willing to pay that price. Like Ruben said, we're not willing to clean our own houses. We're not willing to scrounge every single last American who's not working right now and try to get them a job before we give the willing foreigner who's jumping at the opportunity and couldn't be more enthusiastic. So we're willing to express ourselves freely without any kind of thought about how much we dislike foreigners, but when it comes down to the end of the day, we act in exactly the opposite way, and that makes enforcement impossible.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes until I start asking your questions. So I want to ask Matt a question. I thank you for bringing up Romans chapter 13, because if you just stop there, then you don't help anyone. You don't give them water. You don't give them food. You're just ignoring the needs of your fellow human. But I do ask you this one question. What is the one point you concede to your opposition?
Well, I mean, I think it depends. The funny thing about immigration is people will paint you into a corner very quickly on either you're for open borders and amnesty or you're for deporting everyone. And frankly, there's not a lot of people in either of those camps. I don't know if I'd say it's the opposition point, but I think it's really important to say I agree entirely. We need secure borders. Now, that doesn't mean closed borders. That's an economic nightmare. But it's entirely appropriate for a nation state to know who's coming in and out. The problem is when our legal immigration system, as I think Alex has very capably demonstrated, is dysfunctional. It makes it much easier to do something illegally, to enter the country illegally than legally. So I would say we should have, I summarize immigration reform to people in, it should be three things. We should make it much harder to immigrate and to work illegally. We can only do that if we simultaneously make it much easier to immigrate and to work legally. And you can get into arguments over what's the magic number, or some people would say, well, we don't need numbers. I'm not quite that far. I think actually there's an appropriate place for some regulations, but they're far too low right now to meet the needs of our economy. That's pretty clear. And then the tough question for a lot of people was, well, what about the people who are already here? And as I said, I think there's a middle ground that says the law is really important. That you violated the law is not okay. But in most cases, an appropriate penalty could be a fine. Could be some sort of a probationary process that you go through to show that you're willing to work, you're paying taxes. It's worth noting that most people here unlawfully are already paying taxes, but some of them aren't, or at least they're not paying income taxes. 3 out of 4 are. But show that you're working, you're paying taxes, whatever other requirements need to be there, and have that be a probationary process so eventually people could be fully participating citizens of the country. For me, the trickiest point is, well, what do you do with people who've been waiting their turn in line? Because I have neighbors, where I used to live in Glen Ellen, I have neighbors who are undocumented and struggle with this. I have neighbors who waited in a refugee camp for 25 years before they were lucky enough to be resettled. I have neighbors who are waiting 15 years to get their 22-year-old adult son here because that's the backlog on family reunification, because he just happened to be the oldest child when everyone else was eligible to come. What do you say to him when other people who came unlawfully get in first? And that's where I think the best you can do is to say, well, nobody who's broken the law is going to get that permanent legal status until we can figure out how to deal with the family backlogs, which I think is an issue of fairness. There's not a lot of perfect solutions to this, but there are so many solutions that are better than the status quo. And that goes to this idea of respecting the rule of law. We do not currently respect the rule of law, because if you are here unlawfully, you are probably not going to face any legal consequences for it. And that's a question of resources. No administration, Republican or Democrat, wants to spend the resources to deport all 11 to 12 million people. Doesn't it more honor the law to acknowledge that our whole country's been a little bit complicit in this, and say, here's the penalty for having entered the country illegally? Or it's worth noting, 40% of those 11 million people came in on a valid visa. So this is not just a question of Mexico and the southern border, it's the whole world. But here's the penalty for that. Here's the process to get right with the law, which goes to that idea of reconciliation. And, as a Christian, that resonates with me.
Right. If you have a question, please turn your cards towards the aisle here, and my student assistants will bring them up to me. In the interim, while your questions are being processed and brought up here, Ruben, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I want to take a stab at this question of what do we concede to the other side? And we've all been attacked, so we know what the arguments are against us. And there are those that just bounce off of you, and there are those that give you pause because they're not so easy to refute. And for me, it comes back to personal responsibility. And the reason I agree with Paul that there's a role for enforcement is if you want to help people, the first thing you want to do is not treat them like children. If you are someone who believes that the way to help illegal immigrants is to excuse the fact that they came into the country illegally, they then procured a Social Security card illegally, they then used it to work illegally, they then didn't pay taxes illegally, and in some cases, they broke other laws while they were here illegally, you're not doing that population of people any favors. And speaking as a Mexican American, I would hope that the way you empower a population is not by treating us all like children. So lowering the bar, so to speak, saying we don't really expect anything more from you. And the case that I talked to David about yesterday at dinner is very troubling. I want to write a column that talks about this case, but also makes a list of 10 different things that I find are tough ones, are difficult challenges to my position. So columnists don't typically do that. We don't typically say, the other guy has a good point, and he has 10 good points. We don't do that. If you can do that, that's probably why you're not in politics. But the one that's causing me some distress at the moment is there was a case of a drunk driver, illegal immigrant drunk driver in Central California who happens to be Hispanic in a small town called Porterville that just recently was a DUI, and he was driving drunk, and he went through a neighborhood, he swerved off and got onto the curb, and he hit and killed a 3-year-old girl who was waiting in line, get this, at an ice cream truck. Now, the girl is Hispanic. The illegal immigrant is Hispanic. If you come to this debate in a very simplistic way as being pro-Hispanic, well, good luck with that. Which Hispanic do you want to advocate for here? And I find it very troubling that while this tragedy could happen any day of the week, it could happen with U.S. citizens, the fact that he's here illegally doesn't necessarily get you to this. It's possible that when you continue to excuse illegal behavior, this accident occurred and then there was a hit and run. He hit her and then he left. Now, I'm told on the advocacy side that if you hand out driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, they won't leave, they'll stick around. Human nature says otherwise. They'll still leave in many cases because U.S. citizens with driver's licenses also flee crimes and also commit hit and runs. So for me, the thing that I struggle with most is personal responsibility. Whereas you've got to have a humane policy, but you don't want to bend over backward to excuse wrongdoing.
Thank you. Paul, I have a question here from the audience. Is there evidence that illegal immigrants are a security problem?
No, and I didn't mean to infer that by wanting and desiring a secure border, that my fear was that most people who enter this country unlawfully are a security issue in the sense that they wish to do us harm. But there are, and I think we have to recognize, a group of individuals in the world who do wish to do us harm, who would kill us, and who believe that, speaking of faith, it is their faith-bound duty to kill us. Those are the individuals that we, as a sovereign, should seek to stop at our border. And by and large, since 9/11, we've done a pretty good job of that. Those are the individuals to whom I refer when I talk about a security risk.
Thank you. Alex, is it hopeless to expect help from Mexico and Central American countries to improve their economies and opportunities so people don't need to leave?
No, it's not hopeless. I mean, we just saw a bunch of reforms in Mexico. They didn't go far enough, of course, to partially privatize portions of their energy sector and do some other smart things down there, some small tax reforms, things like that, to loosen their economies, to improve it so that they stay. But one of the things you recognize is one of the vehicles that helps these countries improve is immigration, is people leaving them and going other places. If you take a look at Mexico, since the revolution, one party has mostly dominated all of Mexican politics, the PRI. Up until about, 14 years ago or so, they basically dominated all of Mexican national politics. And the reason why they were able to dominate was because they funneled government funds through local governments and local towns on spending projects, and they funneled it to the places that voted for them the most. So you had to vote for them, otherwise your town didn't get any government funds. Well, all of a sudden what happens in the 80s when you have large numbers of Mexicans starting to leave and work in the US and send money back home is you get an alternative revenue stream, which is why places in Mexico have been able to get rid of this PRI vice grip, vote for political alternatives, and destroy this political monopoly, which did a lot of bad and nasty things in that country, and that's why you're seeing improvements. So the reason why Mexico, I would argue, is improving now, slowly but surely, has a long way to go, but one of the reasons why it is able to improve is because immigrants have left. And then a lot of those who return back to Mexico bring with them, curious Yankee notions of things like, perhaps the local government official should, answer my questions. Perhaps the cops shouldn't shoot people randomly and rob them of all their stuff. Perhaps people should be personally responsible and hold their government accountable. And things like that. I mean, you see it not just with Mexico and Central America, you saw it with Italy. You saw the same effect with return immigrants. I mean, half of Italian immigrants to the U.S. returned to Italy. And they brought with them a lot of different notions about how to run things that improve that country. We're seeing it all around the world now. And so I would argue that the reason why a lot of the improvement that is occurring in these countries is because of immigration in the first place.
Thank you. Matt, why is it that white conservative Christians seem to be the most angry of any group about illegal immigration?
That's a great question because I don't think it's because it's what they're reading in their Bible. I think it goes, and there are some statistical reasons to believe that's close to the reality. White evangelical Christians are, among all religious groups, the most likely to say that they think of immigrants as a threat to their customs and values. Again, I don't think that's not a function of theology, because what's also true is less than 1 in 5 have ever heard immigration discussed in church. So I think there's an imperative on the church, not necessarily, I don't know it's the role of the church to give a sermon on immigration reform, but it might be important when you talk about Ruth to talk about the fact that she was an immigrant and how that informs her story, or talk about one of those 92 references to immigrants in the Old Testament. My fear is that because we've had a mindset on immigration as white evangelicals in particular, that is so uninformed by Scripture, we are fixated on what I would argue, misperceived to be a threat. And where that's particularly problematic to me, as much as I care about the policy, which is very important to me, is we're missing an even greater opportunity from a Christian perspective, which is that missional opportunity. We all are aware of the Great Commission, go make disciples of all nations. Well, you can do that in Wheaton, Illinois. You can do that in DuPage County, Illinois. But there's another, throw another disturbing statistic at you. The Center for Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Seminary found that among people of non-Christian religious traditions, who most of us who are Christians would want to love as our neighbors and share the gospel with, 60% of people from non-Christian religious traditions in the United States say they do not know a Christian. That's kind of a crazy statistic, right? And you might say, well, wow, those people need to get out more. But maybe it's imperative on us as Christians to go in there more, to be really serious about loving our neighbors, our literal neighbors. I mean, I lived for the last 8 years in an apartment complex in Glen Ellen where there's 20 different countries of origin represented in that apartment complex. And when I was a Wheaton student, I used to complain about how mono-ethnic this community was. But I didn't notice that I walked by an apartment complex full of refugees when I walked to Terrace Apartments. So I would really challenge you that the world has come to us, and that's an opportunity for the church. But if we're fixated on a political narrative, again, the politics are important, the economics are important, we need to get to that. But if we're leading with frankly, a partisan political narrative, we miss out on the missional opportunity of what God is doing.
Ruben, after the results of the midterm election, what are the prospects of immigration reform passing Congress? And should the president act by executive order, where permissible if Congress does not act?
You saved the easy one for me. Okay, so you have to look at this in two pieces, right? You have to look at the executive branch and the legislative branch. In the legislative branch, you're going to have something very interesting happen. You're going to have a Republican-controlled Senate and a Republican-controlled House actually get together, fight a very messy internal civil war with Tea Party elements in their own party, and come forward with an immigration reform bill. I've said it like this, it's not that Republicans love Mexicans. It's that Republicans love business, and business loves Mexicans. All those employers who prop up the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which gives tons and tons and tons of money to Republicans running for office. The day that Tom Donahue, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, drops the hammer and says, you either pass this bill now that you have both houses of Congress, or I stop payment on the check. That's when you get immigration reform. And I think you will see that. And the big secret is that there are many Republicans out there who support immigration reform and many Democrats who oppose it. And my industry is very much at fault. The media has not drawn that out as clearly as it should. It has provided a false narrative that says that the Republicans are the bad guys and the Democrats are the good guys. And that's not true, because politics is more complicated than that. As to the executive action part of it, I don't believe that the president is ever going to act with the power of the executive in any widespread, meaningful way. And what I mean by that is that the left wants a lot from him and the right fears a lot from him. And both of those philosophies will not come true, because neither the right nor the left understands Barack Obama on immigration. Barack Obama does not care about immigration. He doesn't care about immigrants. He doesn't care about immigration reform. And he is somebody dating back to his time in Illinois, has typically come from the protectionist wing of the Democratic Party. And what I mean, I use the word protectionist not as they do in Alex's field in terms of trade goods. It's Barack Obama's job as a good Democrat is to protect U.S. workers
from having to get up early and work harder to compete with immigrants. It's his job as a Democrat to protect U.S. workers from the thing that they fear most, which is competition. And so that's why you don't have executive action. That's why he broke his promise. That's why he's been there 6 years and hasn't done it yet. That's why he keeps threatening he's going to do it. Even yesterday, the latest on this is that Barack Obama says, if Congress doesn't act before the end of the year, he keeps moving the flag. You know, I'm going to do it before September. I'm going to do it right after the election. I'm going to do it before the end of the year. I'll do it right before I leave office. He doesn't want to do it because he is first and foremost concerned about the impact on U.S. workers.
And that's in 2007, right? Is like the great example of that you've written about so much.
And yeah, that at the very beginning, I think he tipped his hand in these debates with Hillary Clinton. When they asked him about immigration, he would typically frame it in terms of, we have to do something about the fact that employers hire illegal immigrants, and that brings down the wages for U.S. workers. Now, a lot of people believe that. There are a lot of people who believe that. I've had that argument with liberal Democrats. They believe that the more illegal immigrants you have, the lower U.S. workers' wages go. And he very much represents that constituency. And all that stuff he tells Hispanics and the National Council of Raza and Si Se Puede, and it's all horseshit. That's just political bullshit. That's not true. And the real Barack Obama is a restrictionist at heart.
Can I kind of offer a contrary perspective?
Quickly,
No.
so I can move on to Paul.
Well, let me just predict. I don't disagree with all of that. I think there's mixed motivations, but I think the president will act before the end of the year, and I think it has a lot to do with the politics of the Democratic Party. And somebody who's been granted deferred action, whose legal status and work authorization depends on who the next president is a much more likely person to vote for someone who says they'll keep that in place. And it's a really nice political trap, which I have no interest in on one side or the other, for a Republican presidential candidate.
Paul, how do you define the term secure border? Where are we relative to this standard? And currently, unaccompanied minors are no longer reaching the United States as they were this summer. Any insights as to why?
The definition of a secure border is a great question, and I know there are a lot of politicians who like to talk about a secure border. I don't think that, in my mind, we will ever have a completely secure border. It's an objective, it's a goal. We should seek to have one. And again, primarily because I think there is a threat to the United States. It's a very real threat, and we need to make sure that people are not easily entering the country to do us harm. It's a ridiculous notion, for example, to think that we could build a fence that covers the 3,000-plus mile border between Texas and California. That isn't going to happen. Nobody wants to do it. I was reminded, as we were talking about enforcing the laws, Napoleon, who turns out has a lot of great quotes, but Napoleon said that the best way to get rid of a bad law is to enforce it. If you enforced the laws of illegal immigration, if you really sought to gather those 11 million people who are here unlawfully in the United States, there are in the Bureau of Prisons today about 210,000 beds, 210,000. Only 10% of those beds are currently occupied by individuals who have entered the country unlawfully or committed some crime aligned with illegal immigration. You'd have to sweep out the blind sheik. You'd have to get rid of Jeffrey Dahmer's killer, I guess, and you'd have to get rid of all sorts of other people to move in just one small percentage of the 11 million people who are here unlawfully if you really wanted to enforce that law. So a secure border for me means one in which we strive to keep those people out of the country who would do us harm. We will never 100% accomplish that goal. That's a great and I think legitimate fear of many people who watch that issue. As for the unaccompanied minors issue, I know that there has been a great deal of work and effort in those countries. That doesn't apply, as you know, to Mexico, but in those countries south of Mexico, to educate people there about the risks of coming into the United States as an unaccompanied minor. And I think that may be part of the reason that there's been a lowering of the number of individuals who are entering the country in that fashion.
Thank you. Alex, are there any similarly attractive countries in the world besides the United States that have a better, more enlightened, workable immigration policy? If so, what are the distinctives of that policy? And let me just tack on a question. What did you mean when you wrote, and you coined the phrase deporter-in-chief? 2 questions.
Well, I'll start with the last one. Deporter-in-chief. So that's a term I use to describe President Barack Obama and his immigration enforcement policies. I think like 2 or 3 years ago I wrote that. If you take a look at the intensity of immigration enforcement in this country, this president has been the greatest enforcer since Eisenhower in terms of enforcing the immigration laws. I mean, if you take a look, if you compare, for instance, George W. Bush to Barack Obama on average during each year of his presidency has deported about 1.5% of all the illegal immigrants in the country every year from the interior of the United States. That doesn't count people on the border who are put through process, and that's from the interior of the United States, people who have been living here, has deported on average 1.47% of the population every year of his presidency, compared to George W. Bush, who deported 0.7% of the population every year. So if you're okay at math, Barack Obama is about twice as enforcerer as Bush in terms of those numbers. And you can see everything from appointing Janet Napolitano, the Democratic governor of Arizona, who up to that time had signed, in 2008, had signed the most anti-illegal immigrant enforcement law in the entire country up to that point. As Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, you saw the expansion of the Secure Communities program to jurisdictions across the country, a 3,000% increase in the number of jurisdictions that had to enforce these laws. You saw a huge increase in the number of worksite inspections by ICE agents, remote audits, I-9 audits, the government using all different types of data to try to detect and deport unlawful immigrants, the conscripting of local police forces. So I think the president has a very undeserved reputation as being pro-immigration. For all the reasons that Ruben said, for all these reasons, I will give him credit on DACA. That's a small thing, thank goodness. But everything else that he did is atrocious in this regard. Now, the other question was...
I think that's an example of the tail or the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah. It's a good tale, though.
Let me
Other
find
countries are good examples.
other countries that are doing it right.
So we like to pat ourselves in the back in the U.S. as being like the most immigrant-friendly country in the world. And in terms of the number of people who come here, that's true. We have more immigrants here as a number of any other country in the world. But we're also one of the largest countries in the world. You know, there's 317 million of us. Only India and China are bigger in terms of population. About 14% of our population is foreign-born. Canada has a foreign-born population of 20%. Australia has one of 28%. Switzerland has one of about 30%. They have much larger legal immigration systems, both on the high end, letting in more high-skilled people, but they also have large and robust guest worker visa programs for lower-skilled people. That's allowing people to come here temporarily to work for a year or 2 or 3, go back to their home countries, come back again if they want to. They have much larger scale systems of this that are much better run than the United States does. If you take a look at all the OECD countries in terms of the percentage of our population that's foreign-born, the U.S. is right in the middle. So we have a great immigrant heritage in this country. I think we're fantastic at assimilating people, far better than all these other countries in the world. I think we have great institutions that help us do that, but our laws are what lag behind. Our laws are stuck in this sort of restrictionist, progressive era, 1920s through 1960s mode that are totally unsuited to the modern world, and quite frankly, were never suited to the past either. So those are some other countries that have some better policies.
Thank you. Matt, is it possible to honor God in terms of being hospitable and loving by having an occupation in law enforcement that finds and detains illegal immigrants?
I want to hear the answer to this one.
That's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. And I think it is really important, too, to recognize. I mean, I was on the border a couple of weeks ago with a Border Patrol agent who are, there's a few bad apples in every group, but for the most part, people working incredibly hard, trying to do their job, which they didn't write the job description for, right? And I think that's it's not necessarily the job I would sign up for, but I think we need secure borders. I think we need to know who's coming into the country. So it's an entirely legitimate occupation, and it's a legitimate role. And, the guy I was talking to, who's a Border Patrol agent, was the first to say, I wish they would fix our visa system, because it'd be a whole lot easier to find the few bad apples coming through if the majority of the people who, are going to make it in and eventually integrate into our economy and our society could come in legally. But I don't think, I certainly would say we need good, especially I'd say good Christian people in those roles who can bring with them the discernment of how do I do this in a way that is just and respects the rule of law while also, recognizing that these are human beings made in God's image.
Thank you. I hope Paul Charlton can sleep tonight. So, Ruben, we've spent a lot of time talking about what's broken, and we just have a few more minutes to talk about possible solutions. So could you outline your ideas of how do we fix this terrible situation we're in?
Thank you. So one of the things I hear from people a lot, there's always like an engineer in the audience or a reader of a column who comes at this as a problem that needs a solution. And they'll come, maybe some of you after this will come up and say, I don't understand why they just don't, and we're done. And you need not think that way. I don't want you to think that way. Because this is a scenario that plays out in Washington. This is a problem that people like me, who long ago wrote against Proposition 187 in California in 1994, and then wrote a lot of columns about the Arizona immigration law, I have always taken the position, and my side of the argument has taken the position that this has to be solved in Washington. Well, the problem is Washington's broken 6 ways from Sunday, and particularly on immigration because of all the money and all the things we talked about here today. So that is like the church for dishonesty in America, Washington, D.C., right? So the fact that this is a dishonest debate that has to be solved in Washington, the game's all rigged against getting a solution. So to my mind, the solution, the very first thing you need to do is not present a 10-point plan. I have a 10-point plan. Everybody's got a 10-point plan. The very first thing you need to do is speak honestly about this debate. I said this was a debate with a lot of fog, a lot of smoke, and no mirrors. You need to clear the smoke. You need to do all you can to clear up all the BS, all the lies, all the smoke, all the PR spin, all the partisanship, and understand the problem. And the right likes to lie because it says, well, race really isn't part of the discussion. This is not about race. And the left likes to lie because it says, those union members would actually go do those jobs, in these horrible circumstances if you just paid them more. It's really a money issue. So the left lies, the right lies, everybody lies. And I think that the way you get to a solution, before you can even get to my 10-point plan, you've got to be able to clear the fog, speak honestly about this problem, and understand the problem. And then typically when you jump in, you'll see that the beginnings of it are what George Bush had right when he was president, the three-legged stool. It starts off with three components. It's very simply a guest worker plan to bring in immigrants to do jobs that Americans will not do, a legal status plan for the 11 million who are here, not directly to citizenship, but to legal status without citizenship. They can walk the rest of the way on their own. It's not a bar to citizenship, but they have to walk the way. Again, don't treat them like children. And the last component is some smarter way of enforcing the border. And let me just say this, one of the paradoxes, people have it in their mind that if you take the Border Patrol, which is now 20,000, there's twice as many Border Patrol agents as there are FBI agents, okay? The Border Patrol is not hurting. We spend $60 billion a year for the Department of Homeland Security, $15 billion of it in border enforcement measures. We have it in our mind, in our brain, that if you have 20,000 Border Patrol agents and you double the number, as Congress wanted to do, to 40,000, then you are twice as secure, okay? The reason that doesn't work that way is because we have read stories that said that the Border Patrol is saying, don't send me any more agents. I don't have time to train the people you're sending me now. So I'm sending them out into the field untrained, which isn't doing anybody any good. So you need to do smart enforcement and not just tough enforcement. That's the three-legged stool. From there, you can add on all the ornaments you want to the Christmas tree. But the very first thing, remember, is speak honestly about the problem.
Thank you. And I also note that the only bona fide terrorism case that I'm aware of that involved a border crossing was United States versus Rassam, which a North African didn't cross the southwest border. He crossed from Canada into Washington State. So if you hear a lot of foo-for-ah about the ISIL coming over in tanks and technicals from the southwest border, I'd respectfully suggest you should do your homework. Paul, why aren't some illegal immigrants considered refugees? For example, illegal Mexican immigrants fleeing the violence and cartels.
I'll answer that, but I want to disagree respectfully with my friend David, that at least to some degree. I know there's been a great deal of hyperbole and exaggeration about the threat and the national security threat on the southern border. But it is a real threat. I would not discount it. It exists. One of the reasons we've done well, and I think I can say this in this public arena, is because we work well with the Mexican intelligence agency. They are a good agency, and they will alert the United States when those threats are real. And it is good. It's right. It's appropriate to think about the fact that it is an exposed border, and that if you wanted to come here to do us harm, that would be one mode of entry. And now I, too, have forgotten. The second part of that question was...
About refugees, why are illegal Mexican immigrants who are fleeing from cartels and violence not
It's a
treated as
political
refugees?
question, and I remember talking about this often when I was U.S. Attorney. I remember, David, it came up when we went to Mexico City and met with the Attorney General of Mexico. The United States government does not want to insult the Mexican government by allowing individuals to come into the United States and claim asylum from political persecution in Mexico. The United States government feels that that will do harm to its relations with the Mexican government, and that is my understanding of why it is we don't grant political asylum to Mexican nationals when they enter the country unlawfully.
I want to thank you all for some great questions. I only have time for a couple more. Alex, what is the single most significant argument for the other side of immigration from your perspective, not based on insignificant arguments that they, not the bad or insignificant argument that they use? So what's the best argument on the other side from your perspective?
This might be an odd answer, but I think the best argument that I've heard is that if we radically, let's say if we liberalize immigration, allow a lot more legal immigrants in, then it could fundamentally change the political institutions of the United States in a way that would be bad. I mean, we're blessed to live in a country where we have, a good amount of freedom, a relative amount of freedom compared to the rest of the world that's high, where we have relatively free markets, free expression, things like this, and perhaps a very large increase of people from places where these are sort of different concepts could change these institutions here in the U.S., either through the political process or through some other means. Now, I've tried to study this a lot to answer these questions. A lot of my academic research tries to address to what extent immigrants change the United States or other countries where they go to. And I can fortunately report that not much for a lot of reasons. One, the people who decide to come here are generally the more individualistic, adventurous, energetic people who are attracted to this place. I mean, if you're let's say if you're a Pakistani nationalist, just to give you an answer, like a Pakistani nationalist who loves everything about Pakistan and you think it's the best place on earth, the chances that you're going to immigrate to the United States to live and set up shop is pretty small. If Pakistan's great, then you're going to stay in Pakistan. So the U.S. is really good at attracting people who are dissatisfied with where they're from and who come here today. So but the possibility that there could be some kind of change like that, either cultural or political, through a very large increase in legal immigration, that's probably the thing that I think about the most.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. I want to thank you for your inquisitive questions. Please join me in thanking our panel.